All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to the Maryland Public Service Commission's Rulemaking 63. We are here today to consider revisions to the Code of Maryland Regulations regarding porous performing feeder standards, COMAR 20.50.12.03. The proposed revisions, as recommended by the PPF Workgroup, would standardize the selection of porous performing feeders to use a performance-based criteria based upon a comparison with the electric company's system average reliability indexes. The proposed regulation would also define a repeat porous performing feeder as one that is on the list of porous performing feeders during the 3 consecutive 12-month periods. So for our order, we will first hear from Commission staff. After that, we'll hear from the utilities. Following the utilities, we will invite OPC to the table. And then once OPC has spoken, if there are other persons who would like to comment, we will hear from them at that time. Finally, we will hear from staff to respond to any of the comments. I did want to start by thanking the staff and the porous performing work group for all the time that they put into this and for the proposed draft regulations we'll be considering today. With that, do any of my fellow commissioners wish to make any opening statements? Okay, if not, I will also just let commissioners know that you are invited to make comments or ask questions at any time during the presentations today. You don't have to wait to be recognized. So with that, we will go ahead and proceed with staff.
Thank you, commissioners. Happy Solstice Day.
Thank you.
A concern was raised during the 2016 annual hearing in case number 9353 that the porous performing feeder selection criteria might result in work on porous performing feeders and repeat porous performing feeders that might not be cost effective. In order number 8775, the Commission directed a work group to review this, and the porous performing feeder work group filed its final report on June 30, 2018, recommending some revisions to the Commission's regulations. And Mr. Kevin Zhang will discuss the changes.
Good morning, Commissioners. Kevin Zhang with Engineering. The changes in the reports also have been summarized in the filing from the Engineering Division dated June 14th. I'm just going to go through them briefly. Engineering and staff supports the changes being recommended here because of the following. It improves the consistency of the porous performing feeder regulations statewide because it will eliminate the current inconsistencies among the Maryland utilities. It will also improve focus on the feeders with genuine poor performance because we believe this work group in its January 30th filing have arrived at the best performance-based PPF criterion by defining the PPF as exceeding 250% above both the safety and safety indices. And also, we believe the recommendations would improve the selection criteria by including the correct outage exclusions. This is to add the source loss as one of the exclusions. And lastly, the other advantage is that it will improve the repeat porous performing feeder criterion by redefining the selection criterion as 3 years or 12 months in a row on the PPF list. So in conclusion, engineering staff would fully support the recommendations.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
I have 2 questions, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask regarding the feeder performance, can externalities from the feeder affect its performance rating? That is to say, could a lack of, say, vegetation management for a particular area of the system affect the performance of a feeder if it's kind of a repeat vegetation management problem?
Maybe the best way to phrase is the vegetation management certainly have an influence on the performance of a feeder.
Understood. Understood. The reason I asked the question is the part about outages, major outages. They could be related, and we're going to exclude them for affecting the performance rating of a feeder, but it could be a repeat problem with that particular feeder due to the externalities, maybe related to a major event or vegetation management or something else. I'm not sure how to wrap my head around that. I just wondered if you had any way to illuminate that for me.
Well, in our first work group that was organized between the fall of 2016 and 17, we did examine a toolkit you can use to address the issues with a poor performing feeder. So vegetation management is on that toolkit, so I think all the factors would have been considered. I wonder if that answers your question.
I suppose it's fair to say that you never get a perfect metric, and these are all interrelated in one way or another. So I'm fine with that. I was just curious, how they fit together. The second question I had for staff was the comparability of numbers, assuming that we do the rule change, the comparability of the numbers pre and post. How do we interpret the performance of these feeders pre and post, even though the change is probably indicated, notwithstanding we still have to hear from everybody. How do we compare the numbers on a continuum?
Are you referring to the performance indices pre and post the changes?
Yes.
I think one difference is because one of the recommended changes is to revise the exclusions. So the indices you'll be using for calculating the PPFs with this change will be different because the source loss will be added to the exclusions.
Right. Right. But is there a way to kind of correlate the two different sets of numbers, pre-rule change and post-rule change? Go ahead, Mr. T.
And one way would be if the commission directed the electric companies to report using both methods for the first time. That way you could see direct differences caused by the change in regulations.
That's interesting. Thank you. I appreciate that.
The reports will be thicker, but we will have the information.
Commissioner Herman?
Thank you. A couple of questions.
Did you have a question?
First, the utility companies have, or the Exelon companies have suggested some changes. Do you have a view on those changes?
We've reviewed the changes, and Kevin reminded me that the very first iteration of our changes included some of this language. However, in reviewing the changes submitted by the Exelon companies in their June 14, 2018 filing, which recommended two clarifications. The first of the clarifications at A2A regarding source loss uses the words defined as any outage that occurs on the feeder by an event occurring external to the feeder. And that's consistent with our understanding of the meaning of source loss. However, it uses the words defined as, which under the style guide for writing the COMAR would indicate a definition which would have to go in a different regulation. As such, staff is suggesting that instead of using the words defined as, we use the word including. And I've received some indication from the Exelon companies that they're happy or satisfied with that change.
Okay. And you're comfortable with including, which could in theory mean something else in addition to any outage that occurs that a feeder, because including would be that includes it but is not necessarily exclusive?
Well, it would the word including would indicate that that is the types of events that would be considered to be excluded under the source loss criteria.
So if an additional outage occurred, that would, if an exclusion were to occur based on that, it would be discussed, and if somebody wanted to dispute it, they would have the opportunity to do that.
It would certainly bring up that event for further evaluation.
Okay. And these reports would include, if there were source losses, they would include those in the reports so that we would know which source losses they were using as part of the exclusion?
I'm sure they would be identified for the hearing. Staff tends to have some significant discovery on these reports.
Okay. So there's an opportunity to find out specifically which source losses might be included in the calculation.
Yes.
Okay. So another question I had is about how many feeders. Do you know about how many feeders this would result? This change is going to result in how many feeders being worked on, and is it comparable to the current number, or is it less? That's question number one. So we'll start with that one. Do you know?
The current report, the report dated January 30th of this year, did a sensitivity analysis, which is not to just apply the different the inclusion of the source loss as exclusions, but also to apply the other two recommendations. So in that report, we do have a comparison of the number of feeders that would have been addressed with the newly recommended approach recommendations, and that's well, the short answer is it will result in fewer feeders being addressed on an annual basis. It will not be the 3% as has been the case before, which is the COMAR requirement. So our conclusion is in a typical year, that number is down to about 1.5% of the customers in Maryland.
Right, 1.5% of the customers. I saw that in your report, but is it how much of because the prior standard was 3% of the feeders, not 3% of the customers being affected. Is there it's not that I'm suggesting that I'm uncomfortable with the standard. I'm just trying to understand the impact about how many, if it's less, how much less? Is it 50%? Is it 10%? Do you have a sense in terms of how much what's the difference? How much fewer?
Yeah, I believe your question is really how many feeders would end up being addressed. So
right.
That same table actually, which give you the 1.5% of customers, also has the average count of feeders being included, which is 41 if you run this scenario for the past 5 years, versus the 91, which would have been the case, which has been the case
okay.
between 13 and 17.
So about half. Okay. And is the goal to get to zero? Do you think that, do you think we'd ever get to zero with a 250% standard?
Statistically, it's possible,
Mm-hmm.
but it may be a long way getting there.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. So both of these standards, is it accurate to say that they were based on, the 250% metric, what they're doing in Texas, and then the repeat porous performing feeder, that's based on how things are working in Ohio. Is that correct?
The question I just answered, Commissioner Herman, is really just about the regular PPFs, not repeats. The repeats are summarized in a different table. But if you're just simply talking about
this is a whole different question. I'm just interested to know the role that that fact play, that these are being used in other states, the 250% standard and then the repeat forest performing favor being used in Ohio. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. We're adopting from the regulation from 2 other states, and we're made. Yes.
Okay, and so that was a significant reason for moving to these standards. I mean, I'm just trying to understand through the I guess it was 1-2 year process.
You can say that because the first work group that was organized in late 2016, resulting in January 31st, 2017 report, the progress report, we did conduct extensive survey of the practices in other states, where we observed that a state of Texas was running a performance-based criteria, and the state of Ohio, among others, have this regulation on repeat PPFs. And then we look at our own scenarios to run our sensitivity analysis, and then we ended up adopting the 3 changes you look at here today.
Okay, and have these? So you started the survey in 2016. So these standards have been in place in these states for a number of years. Do you know how many years they've been in place?
Honestly, off the top of my head, we do not. We do know they were in effect in 2016 when we did our survey.
Okay, then again, I'm not trying to snub you. Do you have any kind of sense of how these have played out? These standards have played out in these states. I mean, you're making the recommendation, so obviously you're comfortable with them. But I'm just curious if we have any kind of data at this point. Has that achieved both maintaining reliability and hopefully done so in a cost-effective manner?
It's not being extensively studied in those reports, but we did have staff have conversations with staffs in other states, so that there is really no rigorous studies from our end or their end on how they played out. I think the report we're looking at from our commission is probably the most comprehensive one study out there, but the sense we got is they worked out well and they make sense.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Have any other questions? No? Okay. All right, thank you. So that concludes staff for presentation. Great. We'll go ahead and invite the utilities up to the table. Thank you.
Show up.
Okay, so do we just have the Exelon utilities that want to present today?
I didn't really have anything to say other than what we said in our letter. I did want to confirm the change that we were suggesting with respect to source loss. We weren't trying to run afoul of the handbook. I just didn't have the handbook. So we agree with staff to change defined as, because we don't want to start, the rulemaking all over. So Mr. Dean did contact us via email, and we indicated that we were fine with that change to our proposals. We were part of the work group. We support the rule. We think it's moving in the right direction. We understand the Commission's desire for some uniformity in these rules, and we ask for some implementation guidance also. Other than that, be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. Do commissioners have any questions for?
Just a quick question. Did all the utilities participating in the work group come to consensus on this?
That's my recollection, Commissioner.
Okay.
And I think I've seen in the filings, everyone is supportive of these rules. It was a good,
So
healthy process.
we don't have everybody here today, but if someone was squawking, we would know that, right?
I would hope so. That's why you have these hearings.
All right, I just wanted to get it on the record.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to introduce myself and Potomac Edison team. I'm Robin Leone with Saul Ewing, Arnstein, and Lear. I represent the Potomac Edison Company. We are here today, but we are standing by our comments, and we do not have a presentation for you.
Okay.
I just wanted you to be aware that we are here, and we are supportive of the...
Would you mind just coming to the table just in case our commissioners have questions? Thank you.
Sure, no worries.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Go
It's all right.
ahead, Commissioner Linton.
Just wanted to make sure we got all the appearances. Looks like we have a few more.
Yeah. Okay.
I won't leave Mr. McKeel up. Beverly Sikora for BGE. We filed joint comments with the PHI companies, and if you'd like, we can come to the table and if you have any questions for us. But we really didn't have anything to add beyond what was in our letter.
Okay.
We got a few more seats.
Yeah.
I actually had a question just in general for the utility companies in regards to the concept of excluding major outage events from the poorest performing feeder standards. As those feeders need to be repaired, obviously as a result of damage from those events, or if there's a suggestion that that event has caused some damage, is there a separate process that the utility companies use to track those feeders to make sure that if there's a problem with them, they are addressed? If we're going to exclude it from the standard here, then we don't want something new to crop up as a result of an emergency situation, something that we might have caught under the old standard.
Let me just make sure I understand your fact pattern. Let's say that we have a poorest performing feeder, we have a major event, we have an off right-of-way tree that falls on the feeder that causes an outage.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the kind of
Could be
situation you're
like
talking
that.
about?
Yes.
Okay.
We just want to make sure that we're not moving those feeders out of the count, so to speak, if they're impacted by a major event. And I'm just trying to make sure that there's a process to keep track of those types of situations.
All right. I'll let Mr. Clark respond.
Sure. Thanks for your question, Commissioner Linton. By definition, major outage events have traditionally been excluded from the selection process for poorest performing feeders in all of our jurisdictions at PHI. It's a common practice because of the normalization effects of weather, the denormalization effects, and you wouldn't want to devote significant resources as a part of a poorest performing feeder standard. So it's more of a blue sky process or gray sky process it could be. However, in those events, when we have feeders that show poor performance due to weather patterns, the PHI companies, and I'm pretty sure I can speak confidently for all the utilities here, it's a part of our normal process to seek out those issues as a part of our resiliency practices, just to make sure that we don't have spots in our systems that are overtly affected by intermediate level as well as high level storms. And the problem is those tend to move from an impact standpoint. And so we have a broad set of practices within all of at least the Exelon utilities in looking at storm events post-storm, just to make sure that we've covered any potential future impacts from a storm that we didn't address as a part of the process. By example, if a feeder is affected by vegetation during a storm event, it's our normal practice to ride out that entire feeder post-event to make sure there aren't potentially lingering events, perhaps a tree that's cracked but not fully broken that may fall in under even lighter conditions down the road. So we try to address those. Getting away from vegetation into equipment maintenance, we look for issues where a cross arm or other connections, other hardware type issues may have been affected by an event. That's a part of the post-storm follow-up process that we execute and document as internally, from our PHI and Exelon process. And I'm glad Mr. Schwintek can certainly add comments from the BGE perspective.
I was just going to add that, kind of specifically, we do have post-storm inspections. So we are going out and, looking to see, is there anything that, we didn't catch or that, needs to get tightened up. So, we are going out after the major events to make sure that we're catching those kind of things.
The only comment I'll add is that we also have an inspection program that inspects half of our system every 2 years. So in that 2-year process, we will be inspecting the overhead portions of every distribution feeder to catch any lingering issues that may have arisen during a major outage event.
I apologize. Would you mind identifying yourself?
Sorry, yes. Nick Schwintek, Manager of Reliability and Maintenance Planning for BGE.
Now, I was also going to ask if those at the microphone, if you'd like to identify yourselves and who you're with.
Tiffany Troutman, Chop Tank Electric Cooperative. Chop Tank supports the proposed revisions to COMAR. We don't have a formal presentation, but with me today is Todd Byerly, who is our Vice President of Engineering, and he can answer any questions that you may have.
And Mr. Chairman, we've been joined at the table by David Bedard of the Potomac Edison Company, who can also answer questions.
Thank you.
Right. We at Potomac Edison, we have other programs similar to BG&E that would mitigate issues during major outage events for feeders. So, but you are correct. The PPF program was intentionally designed to not include major outage events or performance of feeders during major outage events.
Okay, so, all right. So I just want to make sure that we're not, by changing the standard, we're not creating another problem further down the line. But if we have a process in place that already addressed that, then we don't want to have a duplicative standard either. So.
Correct. But the former standard also didn't include feeders' performance during major outage events.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Did you want to address the question also to Chop Tank at the microphones?
Oh, sure.
Yes, sure. Give them a chance since they're here.
I would just echo Mr. Clark's sentiments that in the past, poorest performing feeder standards, major storms were typically excluded. And yes, we do also do the same things where we'll ride through any impacted areas looking for any lingering problems after a major event.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners have any other questions for the utilities? Commissioner Herman.
Mr. Clark, so I asked the staff this question, and I'm just curious, is the goal to get to zero? Do you think, we'll ever get there?
As Mr. Zong related, statistically it's possible. However, the way to get to zero is not to what I'll call calendarize a program. What this change from my perspective as a reliability and engineering professional, this incents us to get out ahead. So yes, I would have a personal goal not to have any poorest performing feeders, although statistically they do exist. But if I'm incented now to reduce my paperwork load and to be able to get on top of those issues closer in rather than address them based on a calendar year, it becomes a reporting exercise for us. And in addition to Mr. Zong's comments, it can go the other way. And so you could end up theoretically with more than 3% poorest performing feeders if that weren't a stopgate in the process. And that would be driven by what I'll call a typically bad intermediate weather year, where you have a series of storms that don't rise to the level of exclusion. And so, as responsible managers of our assets and working on behalf of our customers, we're always looking for opportunities to improve feeders as close in as possible. But to directly answer your question, I would love to have zero. I don't foresee that as an immediate option. Just depends on a number of factors that may be in or out of our control. So keeps us on our toes.
Right. And Mr. McKeel or Ms. Sikora, if you all might be able to answer this. Would it be typical that if you, in your report, that you would include, the source losses, which ones you were using as exclusions in your report, or is that something you would respond to in discovery?
Frankly, I hadn't thought about it, but now that you've raised it, I think it would only make sense to include it, to say, hey, it was this event on this day that we're excluding. I mean, we do talk about the major outage events that we exclude, so I would think we do something similar, that we would describe the source loss events that we're excluding.
Hadn't thought about the question. We could do it either way.
Okay.
Probably up front is better than asking data requests.
Presumably. Okay. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions for utilities? Well, thank you very much for being here today to answer our questions. And we'll now invite the Office of People Counsel.
Good morning, Commissioners. Teresa Zarsky on behalf of the Office of People's Counsel. I feel all alone here. Anyway,
Ms. Zarsky, that's often how I feel up here.
I'm here today in place of Jacob Auslander, who could not be here today, and he sends his apologies that he could not be here today. As you know, we filed written comments in support of these proposed changes, and we don't have a specific presentation either. I will endeavor to answer any questions you have about our comments, even though I did not participate personally in any of the work groups, but I will give it the college try. So with that, I'm here for questions.
Are there any questions for OPC? I just have one. In previous testimony and filings, OPC raised the issue about diminishing returns from the program. Do you believe that this rulemaking, goes toward that concern and maybe even resolves it?
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, one of the major reasons we do support these proposed changes is we think that these changes will help to get us closer to the goal of balancing reliability and cost to the ultimately paying customers. So we think this gets us closer to that.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess if we have no other questions?
No, just the packing tape noise.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here to answer our questions today.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and invite our staff, to come up one more time, and if you have anything that you'd like to comment on or react to what you heard, and if we have any additional questions up here, staff is available. Great. So first, did you have anything that you wanted to
we have no
respond to?
additional questions or comments. If you have any questions, we can certainly respond.
Very good. I know Commissioner Linton, you signaled me you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one. As every time you change standards in a regulation, there's always the additional challenge of tracking data over a period of time. So now the data that we've had from the last 2 years, for example, or 3 years, is going to look a little different from data we have under the new regulations. So staff thought that process through and how you're going to compare the two and to make certain that the utility companies are adhering to the new standards.
Well, not to the level of detail that may be needed for this kind of effort. So the former question I answered about the exclusion, adding the source loss to the documentation, I think that the conclusion is now to include both with and without source losses. So I do acknowledge, or staff acknowledges, that there will be challenges trying to maintain consistency of the regulation changes, and here we're looking at 3 changes. I think staff would think one way to address this issue is to always have enough documentation, because we understand utilities do keep track of all the data that's available there. Is how you compile and use the data to calculate the PPF with or without the new regulations. But I do acknowledge there is a challenge. For example, in particular, if you're looking at repeats, you're looking at the different ways the same feeder was a PPF with the old current existing regulation, and I believe by looking at should the COMAR language be revised, then starting from the next year, it would be going by a different set of criteria to determine that it is a PPF. However, it will be a repeat if it were there before. So this kind of issues do arise, and we are aware of those.
Right. They're all transition issues for something like this. Long term, it's not a challenge, but certainly over the course of the next couple of years after the regulation's adopted. So I think it's just something worth thinking through. That's it. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Commissioner Herman, Commissioner O'Donnell, any last questions for staff? Great. Well, with that, why don't I just...
I do have a question.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Clarify the recommendation by the Exelon companies on the effective date for me. Where do we take care of that?
Well, Your Honor, it could be done either as simply requiring the reporting using the new standard at that time, so you would have both the old and new being included in the next filings. Or you could assign an effective date. You may want to wait in that instance until the second part of the process for the adoption of the regulations at that hearing.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so we could do it via order, I suppose, or later in the proceeding.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. That clarifies it for me. Appreciate it.
Okay, with that, do we want to have any discussion? Are we prepared to go ahead and entertain a motion to publish this morning?
I think we need to, Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I think we need to adopt the language suggested on source loss as suggested and agreed to, which would read in section A2A, source loss including any outage that occurs on a feeder by an event occurring external to the feeder.
Okay.
So I would move that we adopt that language for publication when we do our final motion.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Okay, with that, well, and I also support this motion to publish, and will agree with Ms. Zarsky. I think this is a great step in ensuring we continue with the highest standards of reliability in our state, which are paramount to Marylanders, and I think it does go toward hopefully doing this in a cost-effective manner. So I also intend to support this morning. Mr. Herman?
Yes, I think it's, I appreciate the work of the working group and all of the parties and being able to come to consensus. I think that's very helpful and very encouraging, and I support the proposed change.
Thank you. Any comments?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also agree. I think this is a good first step to helping to get our regulations to a point that really captures these types of feeders. And at the end of the day, consumers don't know whether it's a tree on the line or the feeder itself. But for purposes of remediating these types of challenges, these are the kinds of changes we need to help really focus our finances and our effort on making the repairs necessary to get it working properly. So I'm hoping as part of the comment phase we can hear a little more about how we transition from one standard to the next. And so I think that's something worth paying attention to, especially since porous performing feeders is a challenge that occurs over a period of time. So, what might have been poor performing before may not be anymore, and so we just want to make sure we don't lose anything along the way.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Linton.
Let me just thank the work group as well, Mr. Chairman, for the hard work in developing consensus. I know that porous performing feeders have been one of the more frustrating areas of reliability improvements, and hopefully this will go some ways to both improving performance and improving the ability of the utilities to improve reliability. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, with that, if there is no further discussion, is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to publish the revisions to COMAR 20.50.12.03 filed by the Commission's technical staff in this docket on April 9th, 2018, as amended here today in this rulemaking in the Maryland Register for notice and comment, subject to non-substantive changes necessary to conform to COMAR drafting requirements.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion carries. Thank you, and with that, we are adjourned.